Konuşması için teşekkür ederim. Benim açımdan çok esin verici bir konuşmaydı. Aslında diğer arkadaşlarımın sorduğu soruları ben de not etmiştim. Ama benim elimde bir tane daha soru kaldı. O yüzden sıranın bana gelmiş olmasını sevindim. Belki Ermeni burada olsaydı daha da farklı bir cevap ya da tartışma olabilirdi. Dün de sorulmuştu. İşle ilgili bir soru sormak istiyorum. Çünkü hem Alberto'nun Ütopya üzerinden yürüttüğü tartışmayla ilişkili olarak hem de Batı'daki sol düşüncenin entelektüel temsilcilerinin yani mesela Zizek bunlardan birisi olarak şöyle demişti iş için. Aktif nihilizmin günümüzdeki temsilcisi demişti. Batı toplumunu ise pasif nihilizmin temsilcisi olarak göstermişti Nietzsche üzerinden. Şimdi konumuz, daha doğrusu James'in dolayımı aracılığıyla Ütopya'yı tartışırken aktif ve pasif nihilizm ya da başka bir bağlam, belki fanatizm içinden bu soruya bir cevap vermek isterse emin olurum. Bir başka şey, daha doğrusu Ütopya üzerinden bir başka şekilde bunu formüle etmek isterim. Ütopya'yı kavram olarak değil de kendi konuşmasında da zaten metafor ve kavram ayrımlarına işaret etmişti. Ütopya'nın kendisine odaklanarak, daha doğrusu tarihsel, siyasal içeriğine odaklanarak kurucu ya da düzenleyici bir imge olarak Ütopya karşımıza çıktı. Özellikle 17. yüzyılda. Mesela Marx'ın komünizmi bu açıdan bir imge olarak karşımızda durduğunda 17. 18. yüzyıl ütopyalarıyla bir ortaklığa sahip değil galiba, sadece kavramsal bağlara sahip. Bu konuda da biraz görüşlerini açarsa sevinirim.
Question. So on the one hand, the question of passive and active nihilism, and on the other one, the historical content of utopia. Yeah, Badiou himself also uses that distinction in the early 80s in his theory of the subject. He has this kind of argument where at one point he says, yeah, something like, the active nihilist is, the active nihilist can be an ally. He doesn't actually embody that position. Now, I guess, however, in order for that distinction to make sense within the context of a debate about revolution or transition or what have you, you would have to think of nihilism as a process, which is philosophically ironic, because you would have to say that there's a logic of nihilism at the same time as saying that nihilism is a subjective condition that undermines the very notion of a directed history. I mean, that's a kind of inbuilt contradiction to, you know, Nietzsche's own argument, which depends on an extremely bold historical claim about European nihilism, at the same time that it has to constantly undermine it, because the substance of nihilism is to undo that very kind of historical direction. So to say that in order to be a revolutionary you need to be an active nihilist, you would have to think that there is a logic of nihilism, and you would have to think that somehow furthering or accelerating that logic has a transformative effect, which I think is, you know, perhaps problematic. That said, it's interesting that he puts that forward, because something that many different theorists and intellectuals have noted just about the habitus or the attitudes of the left, at least in Europe or the West and so on, has been that a kind of neoliberal condition has forced it into a curiously conservative standpoint. And that's, I think, that kind of goes back to some of the comments I was making at the beginning. So active nihilism has this sort of aesthetic attraction, the attraction of destroying and demolishing and so on. While curiously the attitude, the vocabularies, the orientation of much of the European or Western left today is towards a kind of conservation. Something that Pierre Bourdieu made this argument already when writing about neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s. This is one of the things that Jameson bemoans. You know, he says, but you know, Marx thought that there was, you know, that capitalism was both, as he puts it, the best thing that ever happened to mankind as well as the worst. And now we just think it's the worst, and that's not very Marxist, you know. And that therefore there is no potentiality built in, and therefore the position is a conservative one. And I think that's an important thing to think about. I don't think it should be celebrated or condemned. I do think it's interesting, however, that in some contexts, I was at a conference in Barcelona in Spain, and somebody gave a very interesting presentation about the fact that many Spanish leftists seem to be nostalgic for the welfare state. It was a small problem, is that they never had one. The period between 1945 and 1973, the period that, you know, the David Harveys and of this world see as a period of the compromise between labor, capital, and the state, was a period of fascist dictatorship in Spain, with basically no workers' rights whatsoever, no national health system, etc. So that was kind of curious that that conservative nostalgic moment had been generalized to the point that people had a false memory of having lived in social democracy whilst they were living in a, you know, fascist dictatorship with no workers' rights. So I think that's important to think through, because it's also part of the political imaginary very clearly. I mean, for instance, in the writings, the speeches of Pablo Iglesias and Podemos, you know, that's in a sense what I meant, that the provocation that reformism has become a utopia, that there's a particular retroactive and very homogenizing political imaginary of the post-war period, which you can read through various lenses. You can read as a compromise, you can read in terms of the devastations of World War II and its effects on equality, like in Piketty's writings, etc. But that has become the sort of reference point, the defensive reference point. This was very evident, for instance, I mean, at the level of popular culture in the United States in that Michael Moore film, you know, The Capitalism Love Story. And in the United States, I find it shocking because people present the 1940s and 50s as the, you know, as the moment of, you know, workers' rights and, you know, of the welfare state, etc. You know, where it's still a moment where, you know, half of the United States is under racial apartheid, where the levels of anti-communism are extreme, where strike breaking, you know, so you have, but somehow we've, you know, and I think there is a there's a certain responsibility, because actually a lot of these theories do come from the left, and some of them even from the Marxist left. There's a certain responsibility in giving this which is also a very provincial image. You know, it's certain parts of the US and certain parts of Northern Europe where you can make this argument about 45, 73, and so on. And I think that's I think it has had, it's understandable that it mobilizes people, because of course people want, you know, or many people want free universities and national health services and so on and so forth. But it's also a very weird constraint and a very curious utopia, literally in the sense that some people are imagining that it was there when it wasn't. So it is a utopia, it's like a non-place, like, you know, the glories of the Spanish welfare system in the 50s and 60s. It's, but it's also curious, historically speaking, because it's a very close, you know, it's a nostalgia for a very, it's not just a nostalgia for a period that's very temporally close, so in living memory, but it's also a very contradictory nostalgia from people, especially people of a certain generation in the far left, who were the most eloquent and incisive critics of that period as well. You know, so feminist critics of the patriarchal role of the welfare state, Marxist critics of the role of welfare in various forms of capitalist social reproduction, and so on and so forth. So I think that I guess if we're talking about the historicizing the utopias, I guess we have to historicize our own. And I find it interesting that these utopias are then presented in a sense as non-utopias. Like, we're not asking for anything. We're just asking for what center-right people thought was normal in the 1960s. And I'm interested in that objectively, because it has been able to mobilize a lot of people. Certainly has mobilized more people in Spain than the idea of communism. Granted, the Communist Party is a bit sad story, but you know. But at the same time, it also has some very clear limitations because of this inbuilt, in a sense, conservatism. Because it's really stripped of any promise to transform. And I think that's also the other problem in the middle of the crisis. It's stripped of the promise of transforming everyday life. That's not an element of these discourses, and that's, I think, also a problematic dimension. It's almost as if it doesn't have enough nihilism, or its nihilism is simply directed at the state and capital as they currently exist, but there's very little sense that everyday social relations are themselves the object, have to be themselves the object of change. And that's also, maybe to finish on that, my skepticism towards some of the political rhetoric, because some of the political rhetoric, which is very effective, about the disastrous effects of finance, about the corrupt collusion between state, financial, and real estate interests, for instance, much of which is entirely to the point, but has as its underside the suggestion that the majority of the population is, so to speak, innocent. And in one sense that's true, but in another hand, it has the danger of creating this kind of complacency that basically what we all need to move towards is a society that's exactly the same, but without corrupt, you know, financial elites or something like that, but then our everyday existence would be more or less unchanged. And I find that aspect worrying, because I think without some notion of the collective transformation of everyday life, that even, frankly, even reformism is not really, you know, in a sense, not really reformism. And I think the most inspiring movements that have come out, certainly in Spain, which I know a little better, like the movements against the foreclosures and against evictions from houses and property speculation and so on, actually do have, not in a kind of 1960s way, but do have a strong dimension of everyday transformation of people's social relations. And I think one would then have to start thinking from those to to move away from the limited position of simply of thinking that the unifying demand is demanding social democracy, which I understand, but I think is a bit of an impasse.
Başka sorusu olan yok. Son soruyu alalım.
Önce İngilizce söyleyeyim o zaman. Sonra Türkçe söyleyeyim. I want to ask two more questions. If you don't know about them, so just you can skip it.
Okay.
But, yeah.
That's my favorite kind of exam.
As you
You don't
started,
know it, it's fine.
as we are speaking about dual power and
Yeah.
transitional period, and it is contemporary importance maybe for real socialist project or something. So maybe I thought I should ask, what about what do you think about the Rojava revolution, going on in Syria, which is the pretty much as a dual power situation in the sense that there is this more macro regional government which consists of parties, and it is elected, represents people, etc., and has relations with the other also imperial states, etc. But there is also this self-governmental body that is called Tevdem, that is, and as you especially emphasized that as you especially emphasized in transitional things, that it effectively tries to do something with socio-economic change in, really change how people, live their lives. So in a sense, So what do you, can you comment on it? This is my first question. And the other question is, there is also critique of the Rojava revolution from far left or super anarchist thinking. For example, I remember one. This is Gilles Davoe. If I
Gilles Davoe?
yeah.
Okay.
As you also mentioned in your presentation about the communistic measures thing, and as he's into that, and he wrote a very, very critical article on Rojava, and the main point comes to the fact that as it's a transitional or a dual power situation, something not full communism but also not just social democracy maybe, but it inevitably will be the victim of its locality and its spatial boundaries, etc. So the question comes to in a way that bringing up the question of transition maybe needs to bring up also about the the old debate about socialism in one country, but in a very new, of course, formulation, etc. Because this global local dynamic again enters to question as if there is this transitional thing has to happen, it needs to happen in the wider socio-political reality, etc. Thank you. Pardon, doğru. Türkçe çevirin.
Türkçe ama çok kısa.
Çok kısa,
Yani
çok kısa.
birer...
Yani Rojava ile ilgili, ilk soruda Rojava ile ilgili görüşleriniz ne? O da yani bir dual power'ın bu arada Türkçesini hatırlamıyorum da o işte ikili iktidar şeyi var diye sordum. İkincisi de yani çok aşırı sol denilebilecek ya da çok aşırı anarşist denilebilecek neyse Davoe diye birinin Rojava ile ilgili acayip eleştirel bir metni var. Yani hiç herhangi bir yani sadece yani tabii ulusal bir proje olduğunu söylüyor ve hani yeni patronların iktidara gelmesi projesi olarak söylüyor. Neyse buradan da o zaman konu yani oradaki bütün tartışma en sonunda geliyor. Bu yani yerel bir deneyim ya. Ortada da büyük bir küresel kapitalizm var, süt var. O zaman konuda mi yani hani o zaman bu mekan sorununu yeniden de tartışmak gerekiyor ya da ölçek sorunu artık neyse. Ya da bu da tek ülkede sosyalizm konusunu farklı da olsa yeniden bir tartışmak gerekiyor diye sordum.
People who know, who have some information or analysis about how it's been developing, because my knowledge of what's been going on is extremely sketchy and also mediated by very poor journalism and very enthusiastic but also very uninformed leftists in Britain and elsewhere, who, you know, most of whose statements are just very generic statements about there are great progressive things going on somewhere over there, and then you don't really get much kind of analysis or capacity to grasp what's going on. At a very, at a distant and rather abstract level, I mean, there's a few things that are of interest in having the discussion. I mean, one is that, of course, raises that question, not necessarily of the state, but of territory and the way in which historically the levels of territorial separation or autonomy or isolation have at times allowed emancipatory social experiments of one type or another to take place. The more recent and of course very celebrated, even though much less so these days, phenomenon being the case of the Zapatistas in Mexico, which of course had very different conditions, and not conditions of war. You know, and then that's the other element that, of course, to the extent that dual power situations are generally linked to moments of crisis, and therefore the question of war and territory has always been part of that. I'm also intrigued by, I mean, I don't know very much about the ways in which socialistic and federalistic ideas are mixed up in the thinking and the practice of this, but I guess to go back briefly to Jameson, it's intriguing that he argues over and over that actually one of the biggest concrete defeats for that historical imaginary of utopias of the 20th century was not the defeat of communism per se, it was the defeat of federalism. So it was the renationalization of Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and that in fact that a certain imaginary of federalism and federation was one of the things that was really crushed in the 20th century. So it's interesting to see how and if this might develop. It's interesting, one of the very prominent facets that Kristen Ross in her book on the Paris Commune tries to bring out of the debate of figures like Kropotkin, William Morris, Élisée Reclus, who are thinking the Commune as a non-national federated form. And I think it's indicative that she goes back to that legacy of the Paris Commune. At this moment, she doesn't mention Rojava or Koban, etc., but I imagine it's also part of trying to, you know, trying to orient a kind of concrete political imaginary that's coming out of contemporary movements in that direction. I'm very ambivalent about ambivalent, I mean literally ambivalent in the sense both attracted to and repelled by so to speak, the purism of far-left critiques of these experiments and so on. I think there's definitely a value of realism and skepticism, given how many past enthusiasm turned out not to be so accurate about the places and the processes they were enthusiastic about. And I think there's something, you know, I'm also just generally skeptical about the celebrating at a distance, like someone somewhere very far away. You know, this is sometimes, especially in places as kind of deeply depoliticized as the United Kingdom, someone far away is doing something communist, and then you get these snippets, and you don't necessarily want to find out how much your imagination and reality fit, but it's sort of, you know, it's like Kant writing about the French Revolution. You know, he was in Königsberg. You know, people go out onto the streets in the middle of Prussia with these French flags, saying, the French, you know, just about as ill-informed as people in London are about Rojava, I imagine. But you know, and then for Kant being very reflexive about these matters, of course, argues that the revolutionary character of that moment is not with the French Revolution, is with the enthusiasm. You know, it proves that people have an inclination to defeat their personal interests and develop. I mean, his term is, you know, enthusiasm, passionate enthusiasm about emancipatory activity as such, even if it doesn't do anything for them. So I guess that's a positive thing. Yeah, so I guess I'm ambivalent about that discourse because it can then very easily flip into a sort of quiet as well, because we can't have